to assume that everybody can see us, and I'd like to begin by welcoming everyone. My name is Linda Smith. I'm a South African living in Scotland at the moment, but very honoured to have been asked to be part of this by chairing, because I also believe, as all of you do that are present, that decoloniality and decolonization is a critically important area for us to be engaged with as social workers. And so this session by ASSWA on decolonization, I think, is a first, and the extent to which it's being spread across the world is another first. So I'd like to welcome our panelists. I'm going to introduce them to you individually, and then we're going to go through the four speakers. Each person will be limited to 20 to at the most 25 minutes, and then we will make time at the end of the four inputs for some questions to be answered, depending on time. I'd like to begin by just making a comment about the critical importance of decoloniality, not only to those countries that have experienced colonization, because that's where the decoloniality needs to occur, but even in those countries that were the colonial powers. Countries like the UK, like Germany, America to a certain extent, the critical importance of acknowledging and disrupting imperialism and coloniality rests equally with those previous colonial powers. Because while the geopolitical era of colonization has ended, we all know that coloniality continues. And the four speakers that we have are certainly going to unpack how those that were colonies can go about moving away from those relationships of coloniality. But the challenge is that I would want to add is that the countries in the rest of the world, particularly in the West, have to also take responsibility. And I'm sure in future there are going to be many debates around those issues too. So I'd like to just begin. I'm going to introduce all four people so that there's a sense of continuity once they start. Our first speaker is going to be Professor Shahana Rasool. She is a member of ASSWA and the representative of ASSWA on ARIISW. Shahana is from the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. She was the head of social work up until last year and continues in her role as professor and researcher at the university there. Her areas of interest are very strongly around decoloniality, but also we know her to be on the forefront of issues of gender and gender-based violence in South Africa, but internationally as well. So she brings a wealth of very relevant experience and knowledge to this debate. Our second speaker is Dr. Wilkins Ndege Mohingi, and he is from the University of he is from the Pan-African Christian University in Kenya, in Nairobi. Wilkins is very immersed in areas of social development, of poverty eradication, but particularly also around decoloniality and education. He's published extensively in these areas, and we really are pleased that he's been willing to participate in today's debate as well. We then have Dr. Yasmin Tilton, who is from the University of Johannesburg. She's a colleague of Shahana's in South Africa. Her area is also very, very relevant in that she's immersed in issues of decoloniality, but also in the areas of spirituality and social work, as well as a lot of work around social justice and social movements in South Africa. She also is the national coordinator of the Social Work Action Network in South Africa and plays an important role in social advocacy. So we welcome her. And then last but not least, we have Augusta Yetunde Olaore, Dr. Olaore, who actually has an affiliation with 2 universities. First of all, she's from the Babcock University in Nigeria, and is director, if I'm right, of the Student Support Center there as well. But she's currently teaching at the Azusa Pacific University in the United States. And she speaks to us today from the United States. So we have really a global audience and a set of panelists. That's all that I'm going to be saying right now. I'm going to hand over to Professor Rasul, to Shahana. And Shahana, when you're ready, you're welcome to start, and I'll start the timer. What I will do is give you a warning that 5 minutes is left towards the end, if that's okay with you. And then if you
Thanks.
can begin after that.
Thanks so much. Kana, are you going to show my presentation, or shall I put the PowerPoint on my side? I think I'm going to go with my side then.
Yes, Shahana, we received your PowerPoint.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'll let you know when I want you to move the screen. Okay. Okay, Sawubona, habari, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, kia ora, kunjani. Warmest greetings from South Africa. And thanks to Prof. Tatsura and his team at the Asian Research Institute for International Social Work, and especially Dr. Kana Matsua, who's with us today, for all your work in getting this forum together. Thanks also to my co-presenters for participating, and especially to the team at the Department of Social Work, UJ, who are the co-creators that embed this work in their teaching that I'm going to talk about today, as well as to Linda, who was with us to come up with these themes. It's been an incredible journey. I mean, as you know, my talk today is going to be about the principles for decolonial education in social work. And it's really based on the work we have been doing at the University of Johannesburg Social Work Department over the last 3 to 5 years to work towards decoloniality. Before I speak about the actual outcome of the work, I will first provide some contextualization, and then I will talk to you about the outcome of the process that we embarked upon at the University of Johannesburg to decolonize the social work program. That is the 7 principles that are now the basis of the social work curriculum. Can I have slide 2, please? These were the principles that we developed to infuse an attitude and practice of decoloniality in our thinking, doing, and being. But they are not fixed, and a different process with a different group may highlight different things to embody decoloniality in their work or programs. For example, at the moment, Linda and I are writing a paper to look at how African feminists in particular would contribute to the debate and to highlight their voices, which really have been at the forefront of some of these themes. But I will go through these themes or principles in detail later. Let me begin by contextualizing how this work came about. And I think this will demonstrate the power of students to you. Slide 3, please, Kana. So the Students' Roads Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movements, which began in October 2015 in South Africa, declared that the ongoing dehumanizing structures of coloniality and extreme race-based socioeconomic inequality in South Africa continues to exclude and marginalize the majority of students. These student movements highlighted the need to challenge apartheid continuities, which are still evident in current material realities of South Africa. Since we remain a racially stratified, unequal society, students saw the need to mobilize against the ways in which these structural legacies played out in higher education. These students made demands for eradicating economic, class, and cultural barriers of access to education. through the students' efforts to challenge the nature of the South African education system, which perpetuates the hegemony of Western-centric knowledge, its paradigms and epistemology. They forced institutions and educators to look at the education system in South Africa and to find ways to make it more relevant and appropriate to the African context. So despite the end of apartheid, the African Academy has remained a site of Western values, ways of knowing, and worldviews. Hence, some writers like Globalization argue for epistemic freedom and decoloniality to counter the epistemic violence wrought by colonialism. Can I have slide 4, please, Kana? Magnolia and Walsh argues that, I quote, "You cannot decolonize knowledge if you do not question the very foundation of Western epistemology. And you cannot decolonize being if you do not question the very foundation of Western ontology." How do you decolonize Western political economy if you do not question and change the epistemic assumptions from which the edifice of political economy has been built since Adam Smith? Unquote. So looking at the origins of knowledge, thought, politics, and placing the current situation in historical context is critical. Social work education in South Africa is similarly rooted in the project of European colonial expansion and white nationalism under apartheid South Africa. So the ideologies underpinning social work, how we teach social work, as well as what we teach, needs to be interrogated. Moreover, social workers have been used as instruments of oppression by colonial and apartheid regimes in some instances, and many were complicit with race-based racist and oppressive practices. Post-apartheid, South Africa tried to move from a residual model of social welfare to a social development model. I was going to briefly explain this, but I don't actually have time, and I'm sure you're probably aware of these, and so I don't need to go into them in detail. So whilst the move to social development in policy in South Africa has been a good move from the race-based micro-level approaches utilized under apartheid, it still did not challenge the underlying assumptions of coloniality that continued. As a result of the Fees Must Fall movement and the questions students were asking about the coloniality of educational curriculum, this led us as a Department of Social Work to begin interrogating our social work curriculum and the ideologies and theories that informed our teaching, which in turn informed how our students who qualified practiced as social workers. So as a department, we began on quite an intensive process to interrogate, disrupt, and deconstruct our program. Details of this process is available in an article that Linda and I wrote. Can I have the next slide, please? And this just gives you the names of those articles. We can always send this to you later. So I'm not going to spend much time on the process today. What I will spend time on is one of the outcomes of that process. That is the 7 principles that emerge as central to embed the content of the curriculum for both our social work and community development degrees. These principles came out of engagement as staff of the department through several days of workshops in a participatory action research process, which is represented in this diagram. The next slide, please, Kana. And we also worked with students in workshops, and we discussed these principles with them and how we would use these principles to focus on as a beginning to a process of decolonizing the social work program at the University of Johannesburg. However, it is critical to understand that attaining decoloniality is an ongoing process, as many of us are steeped in coloniality. This is the education we received, our modes of thinking and speaking, even our language, that is English, embeds a particular way of knowing, being, and thinking. So overcoming coloniality is not a once-off product or outcome, it is a process. Just by infusing these principles into the curriculum is not enough. There are other domains that need to be worked on. Can you provide the next slide, please, Kana? So for example, pedagogy, the way in which we think, thinking through contextual obstacles. What are the social and environmental factors? Again, I'm not going to be able to talk through each of these domains with you today or the process because we don't have enough time. These are outlined in our publications. So today I'm going to focus on the 7 principles that we came up. And I will talk through each of them briefly as these will underlie the content of our curriculum. The next slide. And these 7 principles are really interconnected, as you will see, as I talk through each of them individually. Next slide, please. So the first principle is power and oppression, because coloniality is about power. It was about the imposition of power to change the beliefs, values, spiritual practices, education, health and welfare systems, etc. of indigenous peoples, which contributed to their oppression. However, as most of you know, power is an extremely complex concept that has been defined in many ways. Postmodernists and post-structuralist theorists in particular argue that power exists everywhere. But even in the post-structuralist context, where there may be different locations for power, that power is not always equal. For example, as a student, you may have power. And this was quite evident in the way the student protests against fees must fall showed. Just as I have power as a lecturer. But what is the extent of my power? How do I, or how do you as a student use that power? This may differ. Maybe in the classroom context, I have most of the power. But decoloniality argues that I need to consider how to dismantle that power. So are there different ways for me to operate in the classroom such that I minimize my power and create the space for students to be more empowered? When we look at decolonization of the classroom, this becomes very important. How do I, as a lecturer, create ways to include the voices and opinions of students and increase students' active engagement in the classroom? As a way of decolonizing and moving away from the notion that the lecturer has all the knowledge. These are the strategies we need to think of. Or perhaps how do I change the perception that book knowledge is more important than lived experiences of students? So how do we as lecturers become aware of our power and minimize it and create alternative spaces for engagements with students that enable them and enable students and other marginalized voices to be heard? This becomes increasingly difficult in an online environment. But we need to consider this in teaching by maybe getting students to present or co-create knowledge. So the process of co-creating and subverting historical knowledge production is an imperative of education in decoloniality. This is linked to the notion of voice, which is one of the principles I will talk about a bit more later. So more traditional models of power, especially those from conflict theorists, say that those who have power use their power against marginalized and vulnerable groups in different ways to oppress them. Thompson defines oppression as the, I quote, inhumane or degrading treatment of individuals or groups, hardship and injustices brought about by dominance of one group over another, the negative and demeaning use of power, unquote. In South Africa, we saw extreme forms of oppression under apartheid. So accounting for the power dynamics is crucial for understanding and engagement in the South African context with people who are or have been oppressed. The complexities of asymmetrical power relationships ever present in dominant and oppressive contexts of inequality are played out further in the social work relationship. The ongoing legacy of apartheid and its collective traumatization and dehumanization is a reality for most social work students who then come into an alienating and colonial education system. These ongoing power relationships, which perpetuate the status quo and undermine African and indigenous knowledge systems and knowledge production by students, need to be exposed and challenged. Apartheid was a structure that enforced power using various ways: violence, politics, laws, economics, to oppress certain groups of people who were couched as inferior. And this links to the next theme, which is the foregrounding of structural issues. The next slide, please, Kana. From a structural perspective, we argue that problems lie in oppressive and inequitable social structures. Structuralists argue that we need to account for power dynamics in structures, systems, and relationships. So it is social structures such as health, welfare, criminal justice, and other systems that are patterned in such a way that they maintain patriarchy, capitalism, institutional racism, inequality, etc. The way in which these systems are organized maintain oppression. For example, there were laws under apartheid that promoted discrimination through segregation of housing, schools, living areas, etc. This was maintained by the police and other systems to enforce oppression. So in order to deal with racism, classism, sexism, systems that enforce oppression, we need to unlock the power structures that perpetuate race, class, and gender oppression. Which brings us to the next principle, which is race, class, and gender. Next slide, please, Kana. In South Africa, race, class, and gender are three overarching big aspects of oppression and disadvantage. We all know that racial oppression in South Africa was entrenched by the apartheid system. Patriarchy was perpetuated through gender inequality and disadvantaged women. Capitalism has perpetuated class oppression and social inequality in South Africa. The opposite side of the oppression coin is privilege. Privileged people are more likely to be in positions of power. So for example, they're more likely to dominate politics, be economically well off, and have influence over the media, and hold executive positions in companies. Privileged people can use their positions to benefit people like themselves. In other words, other privileged people. So looking at this slide, this triangle, what is missing in this triangle analysis? It points to race, it points to class, but it doesn't point to gender. So in a patriarchal society, women do not have as much institutional power or access to this power as men do. In a white supremacist society, people of color don't have institutional power. And in a society of class inequality, poor people don't have access to financial power or the ability to gain access to their power. Those who experience all three forms of oppression experience triple discrimination. The next slide, please. For example, women are amongst the poorest in South Africa. This is called the feminization of poverty. In South Africa, 56% of female-headed houses, 56% of female-headed households are in the lower quintile in terms of per capita expenditure for the 2014-2015 financial year. Black women are the poorest by far and make up most of this percentage, which is a clear example of the intersections of race, class, and gender. However, these three are not the only determinants of discrimination and oppression in South Africa. There are others such as disability and sexuality, although these are pervasive. Each one on its own is debilitating, but multiple oppressions create higher levels of disadvantage and deepen oppression and marginalization. We now move to the fourth principle, which is Africa as the center. Can I have the next slide, please? Historically, Africa has been economically marginalized, and Europe and other Western countries have been seen as the center. Just look at the map of the world and that are shown on this picture. In reality, what is the size of other countries or continents relative to Africa? But this reality is not reflected on the map of the world. So people in the South and East have tried to shift this European and Western domination through initiatives like BRICS, where countries like Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa come together to do joint projects to challenge Western domination. At a more micro level in our teaching and research, we advocate this by centering Africa in our thinking and work. Instead of prioritizing and centering European thought, writers, authors, research, and ways of thinking, through this decolonization process, we have realized how important it is to focus on African thought as the center. So in our teaching, we talk about African approaches first, before Western, Northern, or other ways of being and doing in discussing any topic in class. For example, what would be an African approach to dealing with child abuse or alcoholism? Finding literature on this may not always be easy. So we ask students to tell us how are these issues dealt with in their communities, especially those communities where there are no state social services. So we foreground South African and African knowledges, culture, and ways of being as a starting point. African perspectives are foregrounded, while other perspectives are moved to the periphery and used to support African and indigenous knowledge systems. After African knowledge systems, we include work with knowledges from other parts of the global South and East. A consequence of positioning Africa as the center means that so-called indigenous knowledges or local knowledge systems deemed to be specific or unique to particular local cultures or contexts are foregrounded rather than seen as add-ons and being patronized. Indigenous knowledges need to be incorporated, embraced as appropriate in all forms of practice. Next slide, please.
Shahana, you have 5 minutes left.
Thanks, Linda. Next, the next slide. We need to value, teach, and encourage African knowledge production. Tabede argues that in Afrocentric work, I quote, African history, culture, and worldview become the context for understanding Africans. An understanding of African clients within their context places them in the center of their conception of reality, unquote. For example, let's look at the concept of Botho from Botswana, which is a key tenet of African culture, which served as a social contract of mutual respect, responsibility, and accountability by members of society towards each other. The late Tanzanian Nyerere president spoke of Ujamaa, which, like Ubuntu, looks at a person within the context of their community or family. Rutikanga describes Ubedehe in his writing about, I quote, a cultural-based social protection system of intra-community cooperation based on collective and individual actions, unquote. There are so many more to list. So we need to center these approaches and move from individualistic notions in our practice. Which brings us to Ubuntu. Next slide, please. Ubuntu is the most basic interpretation, in its most basic interpretation means, I am because you are. My humanness comes from respect for yours and my relationship with others. The notion of communalism and reciprocal altruism is inherent in Ubuntu. It is about humanness, a pervasive spirit of caring and community, harmony and hospitality, respect and responsiveness that individuals and groups display for one another. Ubuntu has been expressed in various ways in the region and in different African languages, and it offers hope and redemption, and it offers a feasible framework for participatory and inclusive emancipatory social change. Africans are known for their strong orientation to collective values, particularly a collective sense of responsibility. Research has largely ignored, misunderstood, or disregarded the value of African indigenous communities' collective ethics. This collective ethic stresses humanness, Ubuntu, which is characterized by generosity, love, maturity, hospitality, politeness, understanding, and humanity. The questions we need to ask ourselves as Africans is, do we practice this in our community still? How has it evolved or devolved? How do we make it central to our communities and personal practices as social work or community development practitioners? Next slide, please. The sixth principle we identified stems from centering Africa and is evident in the work on Ubuntu, which is centering indigenous knowledges. Both in health and welfare, as well as other domains, before colonialism, during and currently, indigenous communities in many countries have practices and ways of dealing with welfare, health, governance, and spirituality. With the arrival of colonization and the imposition of the state, these local knowledges have been undermined sidelined, disregarded, and replaced. But we know many coexist even currently. Many African people go to traditional healers, not doctors. For example, one of my students is looking at how women use traditional healers for cervical cancer in South Africa. So how do we include these knowledge systems in our practice? We need to consider how we validate local oral traditions and knowledges in order to build our societies based on local values and beliefs rather than imposed ones. Next slide, please. According to Adora Hopper's, Indigenous knowledge has, I quote, embeddedness in the cultural web and history of people, including their civilization, and forms the backbone of the social, economic, scientific, and technological identity, unquote. In essence, what are the word of mouth stories, cultural practices, and traditions that deal with social issues and community concerns that we can draw on in working with communities? The final principle, can I have the next slide, is critical conscientization and voice. Critical conscientization is a process of increasing critical awareness of social reality through reflection and action, which means that there needs to be ongoing engagement and dialogue about underlying causes of social problems. We use a similar process to come to these principles. I showed you the diagram in the beginning, which is in the next slide. Next slide, please, Kana. Critical conscientization requires us to engage in dialogue, to explore reasons for situations or problems. Freire argues that any human being, if provided with the proper tools, can perceive their personal, social, political, and economic contradictions. Conscientization is therefore an important political strategy to develop a heightened awareness of political conditions of existence. The underlying beliefs is that every human being, even those submerged in a culture of silence, can look at their world critically through dialogical encounters with others. If they are provided with the proper tools, everyone can become conscious and deal critically with their situations. According to Biko, conscientization is a repeated attempt to see and notice the conditions of the Black person and the conditions in which Black people live. Hence, critical conscientization allows people to grapple realistically with their problems and develop awareness of their situations to be able to analyze and provide the answers for themselves. It is asking the why questions and not accepting things as they are. Questioning what is perceived as normal, like owning land as individual, is put forward as normal. Yet historically, land was owned and used communally. So what are the taken for granted assumptions that we make about our social reality? What are the ideas, beliefs, and notions that we need to question? Next slide, please. Linked to critical conscientization is the issue of voice. This is what we do about the social, political, and economic contradictions and disadvantage that are generated to critical conscientization. It is about raising our voices about these contradictions and disadvantage and taking action against the oppressive elements. So once we have the information, understand the social, cultural, and religious conditions that create oppression, we need to build the confidence and courage to raise our voices like the students did in the Rhodes Must Fall, Fees Must Fall movements, so that our perspectives as marginalized groups can come forward. We need to redress the domination of particular voices and the normalized realities that have been created to oppress us. Through critical conscientization, confidence develops to break the culture of silence enforced by dominant others, thus raising the voice of Black women and other marginalized perspectives and challenging normalized realities of white privilege. In the work Dr. Linda Smith, who's our chair, did with students at WIT some years ago, one student said, I quote, "Once you are enlightened, if you are aware of that oppression, you will be able to work against it," unquote. Hence, as a team of social work educators, we realized that raising consciousness of oppression and inequality is critical to amplify the voices of students and marginalized communities. We were really conscious of the need to create spaces and opportunity for students to find and express voice so that they may be heard in everyday interactions and processes. So we felt that if we did not, through our classes, raise critical consciousness of our students to address this advantage and raise their voices to deal with oppression and injustice, we cannot move society. We want to enhance the advocacy and social aspects of social work. We are aware that no education is neutral and made a deliberate choice to ensure that the social work program should facilitate critical conscientization of students through changed pedagogical practices and more conscious self-reflection on power. We truly believe that through encouraging the voices of students as a group who are marginalized and oppressed, normalized colonialities can be disentangled towards the achievement of decoloniality. Hence, this last principle is critical for the enablement of a new generation of empowered social workers who do not reproduce decoloniality in education, action, and practice. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Shahana. That was really powerful. There haven't been many questions yet. There was one question which we will follow up. Thanks for that. Could I ask people please to make use of the chat to ask questions? We are going to aim towards having some time at the end to deal with those questions. I have to just quickly say I was reminded that I hadn't introduced myself. Just to add that I am a social work lecturer at Robert Gordon University in Scotland. And as I said, I'm South African, and I was at the Wits University for 15 years before this. So could we then move on to our next panelist? And thanks again to Shahana. I hope that you can relax now and enjoy listening to the next panelists. Dr. Wilkins Ndege Muhingi, we welcome you and we look forward to your input on reflections on decolonizing knowledge and curriculum, the transition of the education system in Kenya. Thanks, over to you. Similar to Shahana, I will give you I'll interrupt you at 5 minutes to go to let you know that you need to start wrapping up. And then when you reach the 25 minutes, I will interrupt if you're not ending. Okay, thanks a lot. Do you need to share slides?
Thank you very much. I had shared Tana, but oh yeah, she's projecting.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Maybe you can put it in the first slide mode. Yeah. So in the meantime, yeah, I'm Dr. Muhingi Wilkins Ndege. I'm from Kenya, Pan-Africa Christian University in the Department of Community Development, as earlier introduced. And I have published in the area of decolonization and other areas, and the other interest areas are children also, children matters, child protection, and also health. Yeah, so I'm pleased to be here, and I would say, depending on where you are, good afternoon, good morning, bonjour, and just welcome, and I really appreciate. Thank you for all who have taken their time to listen and to follow what we are discussing today. Kindly go to the next slide, Kana. Thank you. Yeah, so when we look at my presentation will be on reflections on what has been happening in the area of education in Kenya in terms of decolonizing or attempts to decolonize the kind of education provided, which by extension I may mention maybe in the area of social work, but I would start general in the sense that if you look at what happens and from the various readings and the realities, you realize that Kenyan education from the colonial period, it was so specific. Okay, the choice of the how, or maybe the determination of how it would be offered was around these three areas. In terms of the races, because of the colonial times, we had these three races. So we had the Europeans and the Asians and Africans. Yeah, so education was offered based on those, and maybe the schools or the trainings that were there were maybe friendly based on the races. The next slide, please. Yeah, so Africans were given inferior education for manual work, maybe if I connect this with the history of social work in Kenya, also you find that social work first was introduced together with the community development, just with an aim of empowering and strengthening. Mostly the target was the women, and then later on it extended like that. But the main focus, or maybe the aim, was just to give these people skills in the manual for manual work, so that they could serve the interests of either Asians or the whites. So on the other hand, you would find the Asians given better education, or maybe kind of because of the middle class, and then the Europeans would get high quality education, and that was to equip them for leadership. So it was so predetermined, and through education, the kind of education you get, if the aim is to empower you, then you see these Africans were disadvantaged. Next slide, please. Yeah, so if you look at it again, the educational dimension in terms of decolonizing, or sorry, colonization, education that was offered, as I have said, was very shallow. As much as it was targeting, you find that Africans were given manual education with the aim of preparing them for manual work. That means that the kind of education was very shallow, and the curriculum also was not really comprehensive, or maybe aligned to them getting maybe the same quality of education, and even the kind of schools, which I will come to, where there were different schools for different races. So it is, on the other hand, we would look at the model that was, or maybe the European kind of knowledge or education was superior based on this, and this is well captured by various writers. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so colonial administration wanted Africans trained in the lowest, so that the skills they get, they are able to practice well within agriculture. They can do carpentry, they can do masonry, they can do other crafts that, of course, we have already talked about manual work. Africans were trained to serve, or maybe in the areas of service. The aim also, other than just giving them, or maybe to serve the interests of the whites, it was also to help to have a base of labor, so that there is enough labor that to a greater extent is cheap. And then you would find this kind of labor would serve the settlers, the European settlers, or the settler communities. Next, please. Yeah, so there have been a number of reforms, quite a number of reforms in Kenyan education from the time of independence up to the moment, or up to now, generally within education, and even in terms of when we look at social work education and how it has moved on. So after independence, of course, Kenya achieved her independence in 1963. The government of Kenya embarked on reforms. The government decided to reform the education sector, so that it would align that education sector physically or politically, socially, economically, or to the challenges in the conditions were existing at the moment, immediately after independence, and then moving forward. So everything was aimed at aligning, so that the kind of education that is provided was in line with that. And then also, it was also done on these grounds, where the government also came up with an idea of coming up with commissions. There are a number of commissions that were put in place, which were aimed at shaping the education system. Of course, the most common one is the Ominda one, but there are quite a number of commissions. I may not go into all of them, but these were the strategies, either embarking on reforming in line with what kind of objectives they were meeting, the education was to meet after independence, and then also reshaping it through those commissions and the recommendations by the commissions. Next, please. Yeah, so reforms, forms of reforms, how reforms happened during, or maybe just after independence and onwards. So I've talked about establishing commissions. Specifically, commissions were to deal with education matters, but this one was on a periodical basis. So the commissions, once established, they were to deal with the education matters on that. Another one is that there were recommendations that these commissions came up with. So the recommendations they gave had to be implemented later on by the government. And this was with the aim of improving or maybe slightly developing the education and even the entire education system. Next, please. Thank you. Yeah, so still just continuing with the other reforms, but of course, interventional kind of within the reforms that exist, others other than the commission and so on, there are quite a number of steps. For example, the first step that the government took was a decision to ban racial segregation. And this is, yeah, of course, it takes a colonizational dimension, or because initially, as we have said, now that education was provided or was given based on the races and the different races receiving whatever kind of education that was predetermined for them. So the government decided deliberately and strategically to ban the racial segregation in terms of schools, and even children from other races and even other maybe lower classes, yes, would attend or maybe have an allowance to get into the schools that earlier on they would not get to. The government again encouraged admission of Africans or African children into schools which had been specifically built for the whites, and then of course even the Asians. And not to mean that this doesn't happen now, but if you compare the rates of how this happens now is not the same as how it was. So the government's intervention into that really helped so that other children from not whites and Asians would access, and specifically those being African. So African members of the commission that was called the Omindo Commission were in favor of this, whereby they would mix, or they would, or maybe the recommendations were supporting the idea of that kind of dealing with this kind of segregation or this discrimination based on the race of the children. And that happened. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, so there are also reforms. I may not maybe explore so much in these, but just to mention, especially other than including these children from African families or African communities or society within these other schools, there was also that change of foreign names. In fact, to a greater extent, you would find schools changing. The government decided to change the names of schools that had that kind of colonial connotation. So a good example is the Duke of York, which became the Lenana High School. Presently, it's called the Lenana High School. There was this Prince of Wales, which became Nairobi School, Jamhuri, presently, which was initially the Duke of Gloucester, and many others. Pangani, which is presently called Pangani, was also Duchess of Gloucester, and many other schools that changed those names so that that kind of colonialistic or colonial connotation was also not there. And then a single common syllabus. At the moment, of course, this was introduced earlier on, just after independence, so that all children, there could be that kind of harmonization in terms of the kind of examination that these children are exposed to. So based on the common syllabus that was introduced, then all children would be exposed to the same examination. The earlier versions of the exams that they were doing, for example, the Kenya preliminary examination, and then later on this was replaced, and then now we had what we call CPE, which was Certificate of Primary Education. And of course, there were other recommendations by this commission that of course, areas around just adjustment in terms of the kind of examinations that these children are exposed to, or these students are exposed to, and the system, yeah, from the A level, O level system, among others. Yeah, so we can move on to the next. Kindly, the next slide. Kindly the next slide. Have you moved? You haven't moved the next slide. Yeah. So yeah. So in line with the social work, decolonization of social work, there couldn't be much we could say in line with the decolonizing social work, and much work having been written on social work and the curriculum when it comes to decolonization. But what I have mentioned could, to a certain extent, relate with what social work is all about and what some of the changes that have happened. But it's just good to acknowledge, based on some writings, that there has been limited, not just locally in Kenya, but globally, limited research when it comes to commitment, especially on decolonization, not only decolonization, but also democratization. And when it comes to addressing equity issues, especially within social work education, and how this can influence future. So if you look at what I've just presented and you look at it maybe in relation to social work, you realize to a great extent still the kind of materials that we're exposed to, which is not just in Kenya, you find most of them are Eurocentric, or they are kind of foreign materials. But of course, much is happening at the moment, interventions where now educators are really cracking their heads to find out which is the best way forward to come up with education materials that are relevant. But to a greater extent, it is not written, it's not a research kind of, but the reality. As Ngugi wa Thiong'o tells us in that our African problems sometimes require our deeper analysis. So for us to address these social work issues, we will need to do more, especially in Kenya. But the reality is that the materials that we're exposed to until now, most of them are foreign, but that doesn't mean that nothing is happening. Now in Kenya, the curriculum is kind of heading towards specialization, and there are many specialization trainings that are coming up in social work, and of course, trying to, as much as possible, to get local content in terms of even the lists of the kind of books students are reading. They are now exposed to local materials that are so contextual and relevant when it comes to practice. Next slide, please. Yeah, so what is the way forward in terms of these, what I've just said, and in line with specifically social work, not just generally decolonizing of curriculum and the system and how the education system has changed in Kenya, but basically the way forward in terms of dealing with this colonialistic kind of approach to education. And you see, greatly, education affects even practice, and of course, as we are looking at it, the future. So there is need, or maybe the way forward is that we need kind of creation of awareness, not just at the student level, but even ourselves. What we are doing right now, it creates a lot of interest among people through these kind of presentations, through various kinds of discussions, and then creating awareness even among students and among educators and many other people like practitioners uh, to deal with those colonialistic connotations or practices. And then advocacy, in the sense that you give people voice. This is in line even with what Professor Shahana was presenting. Yeah, so voices of the people, voices of the students, voices of the educators, among others. Legislation is another area that is very important, where most of these social problems can easily be addressed through legislation, because, for example, establishing a very strong body that is out to strengthen the interventions that aid or maybe try to address the issue of um, that kind of colonialistic approach to training and even practice, or training which may not be relevant when it comes to practice. And then empowerment also would still be around even creation of awareness, but empowerment would still also go to a greater extent, even empowering those who are educating, empowering them in the sense that they're able to then provide materials that are relevant and are very local, and they're able to resonate with what is happening elsewhere, resonate with what is happening in other countries, and also resonate with what is happening currently, so that they are able to marry the two or to merge the two. Yeah, so that's my presentation. The last one is just a thank you and appreciation. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Mohengi. That was perfectly timed, but we really appreciate hearing those, you know, the important information about the unfolding shifts, and certainly the reflection on that gives us a lot of food for thought about how these kinds of things can be changed. There are a number of really interesting questions in the chat box, particularly for you, but also for Shahana, so hopefully we will get to them. I've made a note of the questions, and perhaps we could ask panelists a little bit later. But for now, I'm going to move on to Yasmin Tilton. Dr. Tilton is going to be speaking about community empowerment, an example of a decolonized, indigenized approach. So Yasmin, it's over to you. You're on mute. There we go.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm going to try and do my own share screen, so I hope it's going to work.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. So, okay, so this is always a problem with, my apologies, it's not working. I might have to ask, sorry, it's not working.
I'm going to send it to Kana.
Would you like your slides to be changed?
No, just ask Kana, yes, please, if she can do it for me.
So will you tell her when you want her to move to the next slide?
Yes, please, if she can move to the next slide.
We have already received your PowerPoint, so shall we control it?
Yes.
That's
Okay,
fine. That's fine.
So you'll remove yours and then she can put up the one that she has.
Yeah. So if you can just control it from your side, I can't move it from my side. Thank you, and my apologies. So if you could please move it. Kana?
So you need to stop sharing your screen.
Could you close the, you please stop the share screen.
There you go.
Thank you.
So in the meantime, while we are sorting that out, I'd like to encourage people who haven't introduced themselves yet to put their names in the chat box. Perhaps you might want to share email addresses, or if you, you know, would like to ask questions, please use that. There have been, can I ask other panelists in the meantime, there have been some requests for the slides being shared. Would you be willing to share your slides, and perhaps we could arrange for them to be sent to Kana, and then people who are interested in receiving them could email. I think that could be a way to do it. Alternatively, the panelists might want to put their email addresses in the chat box, and then people could engage with them individually to get copies of those slides. Looks like we're ready to go. Dr. Tilton.
Thank you very much. Kana, can you just move the slide on past that? Thank you very much, everyone, and apologies for that delay. I'm going to be presenting to you a project I was involved in as part of my doctoral thesis, where I presented to a community and worked with the community, introducing what we call body, mind, spirit practices as part of an example of indigenous and decolonial social work practice. And so what I'd like to do is present those findings to you. But before that, I'd like to first do some conceptual conversation. Kana, can you please move the slide? One of the first issues, and I mean, I know I'm talking to an audience that understands colonization, but one of the first issues is to look at what is this colonialism we're talking about. And obviously we are talking about domination of very often people of one race over another, although that is changing, and we're beginning to see colonialism of a different kind. And through this process of colonization, we have people's lives completely, politically, socially, intellectually being taken over by the colonizers. And so to a very large extent, we see that we had the colonizers taking over physical space and our bodies, and then we had what we call the colonization of people's minds. Steve Biko uses that word quite often in terms of enslavement of people's minds, where in fact, through the disciplines of education, law, science, and so on, our minds have been colonized by those who have colonized us. Next slide, please. So in terms of decolonizing, I like to use Fanon's definition, because he talks about being a complete rupture, a disruption of the colonial system. And by implication, it means getting rid of all the things that we have been colonized with. It is about how we restore ourselves as Black human beings. And by implication of that, it means that we have to go through a process of conscientization and individual self-awareness, because what has happened to the self through the process of colonization is that people feel their self-worth has been degraded in many, many ways. Can you move on, please, Kana? So when we look at indigenization and in introducing the body, mind, spirit practices, I particularly look at it from a point of view of indigenization. And so this is about how do we rediscover our indigenous cultures, our indigenous ways of knowing, our indigenous ways of being. And how do we begin to look at authenticating what is locally relevant, what is culturally relevant. In fact, Gray's and Coates talks about how do we create a domestic model of social work in light of our own realities, in light of our own social, cultural, and economic realities in the country. There's a lot of debate around the word indigenization, which maybe will come up later on in the chat. But is it only about domestication, etc.? So if we look at, so if you can move the next slide, please, Kana. One of the things that often we tend to use almost interchangeably, but they mean different things, is about decolonization and indigenization. And so Shahana mentioned earlier, decolonization being about power. Colonization being about power, and decolonization being about how do we rupture that power. But between colonization and indigenization, I think what is quite important is that both of them are about claiming people's right to self-determination, people preserving their own languages, their own knowledges. How do we begin to look at creating or going back to some of the traditional values and cultures and restoring that, which was some important elements. And then also, how do we look at replacing the Western interpretation of our history with indigenous perspectives of history? Kana, if you could move on, please. So in introducing integrated body, mind, spirit practices, this is a more holistic orientation, which is based a lot on traditions of the East and African philosophies. It does utilize trends. It talks about meaning making. And I think the most important thing is that it is in greater alignment with traditional or indigenous practices than is many of the conventional approaches that social work uses today. So many people have said, well, this thing about integrated body, mind, spirit practices, doesn't it just make people complacent? It doesn't really address people's living conditions. And yes, indeed, it doesn't. But what this study has shown is how it has helped to empower people and conscientize people. and I like to use Frere's point there, to empower, conscientize, and awaken people to their own capabilities and wisdom. If you can move on, thank you. So my study used two primary theoretical frameworks to inform my study. The one was spirituality, and in that I used African, Eastern, and feminist spirituality. And the second is what I've just spoken about, was the frameworks around decolonization and indigenization. And in my study, I suggest that there is a close connection between spirituality and indigenous practices, particularly when we look at it from an African worldview, where we look at the issues of interconnectedness, of balance, of harmony, that are important features of the African worldview. So if we look at the context of social work in South Africa, Shahana mentioned some of it, I'll just go over it again. Our history of social work is very closely aligned with the history of colonialism and apartheid. And in fact, social work has been quite complicit in implementing racial policies under the apartheid regime. The social work profession has also been largely influenced by a first world psychoanalytical approach, which is curative, which is remedial, and very often doesn't meet the needs or respond to the needs of the majority of people in our country. So despite the fact that post-1994, we now have a social development approach, social workers in South Africa are still engaged in remedial work when they address personal problems of people. We train social workers in the same remedial approach. And the point that is quite important that again Shahana raised earlier is, despite the fact that we begin to talk about decolonizing our curriculum and decoloniality, we often still use all the literature sources of the past, all the approaches that have been used before. And in that way, we perpetuate a particular kind of approach. Please, can you pass on to the next slide, Hannah? Thank you. So I worked with a group of community caregivers in a poor community on the outskirts of Pretoria, which is in South Africa. It was a poor working class community, and many of the women who were caregivers were from very vulnerable communities associated with poverty, unemployment, and a lot of them facing a lot of personal abuse and systemic abuse in their lives. Over a period of 3 months, I shared with them a selection of body, mind, spirit practices. And the idea was that they would share these, they would practice these on themselves for personal well-being, but also that they would share these practices with their families and members of the community. Next slide, please. So this is just some of the women that I worked with. Can you move to the next slide, please? Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So these were some of the practices that I worked with and shared with the caregivers. The first was looking at just some contemplative practices, what we call mindfulness meditation. It was very interesting in the research and in the literature to find out that we've used this term mindfulness and meditation as if they're a new concept, and yet within the African tradition, contemplative practices is very much part of African wisdom. I then also looked at movements such as Tai Chi work. I looked at breath work and a couple of other techniques that we worked with, drumming, which the women themselves introduced me to because that was quite new from my point of view, and then song and dance and storytelling. Can you move to the next one? So how was this received by the community? Now, given the background of this community, which apart from experiencing poverty and many deprivations, they were also traditionally quite religious, and they were culturally quite conservative in their outlook. They were in a peri-urban area, so they were quite isolated from the more urban exposures, to anything that was alternative, and things like mindfulness or breathwork and so on. They'd never heard of this before. And so what was the response from the women? To be very honest with you, I had some hesitation before, some doubts. I thought that they wouldn't accept this, that it would be alien to them. The response from the women was so enthusiastic. They were eager to learn it. They used to practice on themselves. They used to practice on their families. They were women who worked with orphans and vulnerable children in the community, and they used it in their work with their client families. And then on occasion, they even took it out into the broader community, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. Next slide, please. Next. Okay. So it was quite interesting that the word stress was a word that was used so often by the participants. They would talk about stress all the time. And what we found that I kept on wondering why they used the word stress in everything they did. And so I began to try and unpack that with them. And one of the issues that came out is that when they used the word stress, it was always linked to their day-to-day challenges. So for example, they would say, my biggest stress in life is when I didn't have food in the house to feed my children, or my husband is unemployed and that has caused me stress. And the word stress was quite an interesting point in how the word stress was interpreted, because their stress was everything that was related to the structural issues such as poverty and unemployment. We can move to the next slide, please. No, the one before. No, one before. Yeah. The other stress was really in relation to their relationships with partners and children. Again, you found that they came from households where there was, because of the issues of poverty, unemployment, and so on, there was often lots of fighting, disagreements. The women would talk about the stress comes from their husbands who don't care for them because they are frustrated, because they're unemployed and so on. Again, this link between poverty and personal relationships showed that the stress of living in poverty brings this added risk to relationship breakdown, which was very evident with the women that I worked with. So what were some of the effects of these practices? I identify three key themes. The one was the physical, the personal and emotional, and forgetting our problems. Can we please move over? Thank you. So what was quite interesting is that because of the problems of everyday living, women complained. They complained all the time. My body is sore, my legs are sore, and so on and so on. And as they began to use these practices, they kept on saying, I feel so much better. They felt that they were more relaxed after the use of these practices. They had greater energy levels. And many of them had problems with sleeping. And so they said, I'm even able to sleep better now. I feel better. And the sense that I got from that was that because these women felt so weighed down by their day-to-day problems, they were looking after everybody else, that because of that they were actually now taking care of themselves, and they were able to feel different. Their energy levels were different, and they were able to look at things very differently when they felt better about themselves. Next one, please. Another interesting point was the emotional aspects. The women all the time said that they felt that their self-confidence and their self-esteem had improved. It was so interesting, the point they made. They said things like, I feel better about myself. One really interesting point that came out was, it brings back my voice. And that doing these practices made the women feel like they were, one woman said, I could never talk in front of a crowd. I could never talk in front of people. And now I just feel capable of doing that. And this points to the importance of voice in the context of both culture and patriarchy. For women in those conditions to be able to say, I have found my voice, is a really powerful demonstration because very often in those cultures and under the conditions that they lived, they felt they didn't have voice. Thank you. Can you move on, please?
Jessie, I need to say that you must wrap up in 5 minutes at the latest.
Okay, okay. Can you move on to, okay, this was another issue that they raised, but I'm not going to deal with that because my time is running out. Can you just move to the next slide? Okay, I think the important thing is that these women, after they had used these practices on themselves, they began to take it out to the community and use it. Like there was an issue of a gang attack in the community, they used it. There was another issue where a 15-year-old girl had been traumatized and they used it. And they took it out to a broader community on Human Rights Day. The most important thing was it was never meant for the women to only have those skills to use for themselves, but in doing that, they should be able to replicate in the community. And there was evidence of that in the study. Kana, can you just move on, please? I think just to quickly mention the point of working with the traditional healer. I had a traditional healer in my group, and we recognize that you cannot talk about Indigenous practices without mentioning traditional healers. They are an integral part of the community, and they have such a presence, and many of them do the most incredible work, and even including providing that kind of immediate support to communities when there are no other services available for people in the community. Can we perhaps move on to the next slide? Okay, I think just some concluding comments is just to note the empowerment of participants that has happened. And the important thing is that these practices didn't require any kind of higher education. It didn't need to have a common language spoken. It was particularly effective. It is particularly effective in dealing with trauma, especially where talk therapy is not the most effective. It provides some alternative to conventional approaches. More importantly is that it's accessible to communities, and it can be done and used by lay people in the community. It can be replicated. The most important thing, and I always say this because there's been critique around it, is that the use of these practices in no way takes away the problems of poverty, unemployment, and abuse, but it provided the women with tools and techniques for self-care, self-healing, and it built their confidence to be able to handle the other problems of everyday living in a different kind of way. I have made some recommendations, but Linda, I think that perhaps we run out of time. But just the last one, I suppose, in terms of recommendation is the importance that for social work, it's the importance of seeing this as another approach. We teach our students about play therapy and many other forms of therapy. And this is one form of an Indigenous and a decolonized approach that is important for us to include in our curriculum. Also that it should be mainstreamed. It cannot be an add-on. It has to be mainstreamed into our social work curriculum and into our social work practice. That this is also consistent with the values, goals, and principles of the social work profession, if we look at the global definition of social work. And finally, just that it means we are acknowledging Indigenous knowledges as important to our profession. Thank you very much, Linda. I felt like I've really raced through that. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry to have had to ask you to wrap up, but thanks so much. There are a number of comments as well you might want to look at in the chat. Yasmin, if you might want to just respond. We are racing against time now. I'm going to ask Dr. Olaore to begin her presentation, but before she does that, please would panelists look carefully in the chat box, because we don't have much time to engage verbally. Would you respond to some of the comments and questions that have been put in the chat box? Also, you will see that there's an announcement of a further 30 minutes on Teams that Professor Rasul has put up the link to. If anyone does have time, there will be a bit of a further conversation after the ending of our session. So please have a look there. And then lastly, if anyone would like the email address of any of the panelists, please ask for that in the chat so that they can put it there. in the meantime, panelists might want to do that anyway. So then, without further use of time, can I hand over to Dr. Olaore? Thanks.
Thanks, Linda. Yes, standing on all existing protocols, I respect and appreciate everyone who is here and who have been part of making this a reality. I really appreciate you all. Now, I'm looking at the issues of confidentiality. You know, it is often said that it takes a village to raise a child. It's celebrated all over the world. But the reality of it is, if it takes a village to raise a child, then what should the village know when it comes to child protection, when it comes to social care of children? And I'm going to be sharing some realities that I had to deal with as a professor at the Babcock University, which is a faith-based university in Nigeria, in my capacity as also the director of the Student Support Center. But I will be talking some more about that. Now, just to give us a clarity about the Nigerian context when it comes to social work profession, as a country, we are still in the place of developing our social work professional identity. We are yet to have an act, that professionalizes us as a profession. So much of what we do has a lot of Western influence, particularly when we talk about colonization of the profession. It's like it was handed down to us in the Western world. That is what we have. And we are still in the process of owning and being courageous to stand up for our own indigenous practices as being valid and as being a viable way of doing social work. So that is the context of Nigeria. And then my practice context is that I worked as the pioneer director for the Student Support Center at a faith-based university where the minimum age of entry is 16. So we have students who sometimes are even 15 by the time they come into the university setting, and they are minors in adult environment. And because of that, there is a lot of parental involvement. We don't have such things as student loans. So tuition is primarily based on family funding or from the community when we talk about it takes a village. Okay, so that will give us the context of what happens. So when it comes to when we talk about village involvement in the care of these minors, there is a lot of funding issues, funding of tuition. So there is a sense of responsibility as well as, like they owe it either to the parents or to the communities that is supporting them. And then the village is also involved in terms of welfare and upkeep of the students, making sure that they have all that they need in school. And of course, part of the village responsibility is disciplinary issues. It's often said, it is common in the village that when a child, does something wrong and they go back home, the parents are like, did they correct you out there? Because if they didn't, then they should. So it's the same thing applies at the university level, where communities are involved when it comes to disciplinary issues for students, especially as minors. So they are involved. So it is in this context that social workers like myself are involved in engaging with these minor students in the Nigerian context. The issues that we've had to deal with, issues of sexual misbehaviors or infractions, substance abuse, and academic challenges. So these are the key things that would bring students to the Student Support Center for engagement with a social work practitioner like myself. Now, outside of this, there isn't usually a very well established social services per se, like we have in other countries. But at the university, we were able to put something together that served as services for students beyond just their academics. So coming to the issue of confidentiality is what guides our practice. In Nigeria, we do not have what we will say is our own code of ethics. So when it even comes to teaching, we teach the national NASW from the United States. That is what we give to our students. That is what guides our practice, because we have not been able to form ours yet. And one of those things that is said in the subsection there B, it says that social workers may disclose confidential information when appropriate with valid consent from a client or a person legally authorized. The question is, how do you determine legal authorization in a village context? Also, part of what the Code of Ethics talks about, in the place that I highlighted, talks about in all that, as much as we try to be conscious of very delicate and sensitive issues where confidentiality may be waived, or is that in all, social workers disclose the least amount of confidential information necessary to achieve the result. Now, we have the global guidelines, okay, which also guides our practice. And that is saying in the global ethics, it says that in some cultural contexts, it is characterized by we-centeredness, communitarian living. Social workers respect and abide by the people's right and choice to shared confidentiality. I hope we're taking note of those communal, community, we mindset in the Code of Ethics. Now, when it comes to the philosophy, it's like, as a social worker, what are we doing? Which way? We can either be, according to Congress 2000, that if a social worker, a Nigerian social worker, which most of the time, because of the fact that we are so regimented and we respect authority, we want to go by the books, it's the deontological approach to ethics, which says it's absolute, and it's almost like sacrilegious to go outside of it, like there is no wiggle room, that we have to comply with what the Code of Ethics says is confidentiality policy. Or it could be the teleological approach, which looks at the circumstances. So when we examine that, which philosophical basis are we coming from when it comes to ethical guidelines for confidentiality? Now, we bring this into the indigenous realities of serving our students in Nigeria. One of the things that we come to see is that rather than have the extended, it's usually talked about the extended family, which is anyone outside the nuclear family. But the reality that we have in Nigeria is that of, and in most African countries, is extensiveness of family, not just extended. Extensiveness where you stop counting by blood ties, okay? In the colonial mentalities, you look at cousins based on the children of the uncles, the auntie is the brother, the aunt is the sister of the mom or dad, there are blood ties. But in the Nigerian and African context, it is more of an aunt, an uncle is regarded as a dad, as a mom. Cousins are brothers and sisters. And, and these words will be used to people without even biological ties, such that a neighbor that belongs to a clan is part of the family. Also, the realities is that there's a lot of superstition and suspicion as part of the everyday life, okay? It's part of the mindset. There's a lot of fear and shame mingled with respect that drives our way of doing life and relating to people. And it has been said again and again about indigenous practices that there are other ways of knowing. It is not just knowing from gathering facts, interviewing. There are supernatural ways that people get to know what is going on, and they are valid because they many times are also accurate. There are also the fears of fetish ways, where people feel that they can put spells on other people. In fact, I had that happen when one of my students who had substance abuse issues was hallucinating. And, when we're trying to refer him for rehabilitation, he said, no, I know where this is coming from. It is my mother's rival that has put a spell on me. That is why I am doing drugs, okay? So these are realities that we had to deal with. So the question now goes to, how do you establish legality? How do you establish the amount of information that you share with people that are connected without taking the hook, line, and sinker of the individualistic approach of the colonial mentality, that seeks to separate people based only on blood ties. So I'm going to be looking at, so how do you balance this? How do you balance the we-centeredness with the communitarian living and the client's rights, the client's choice, and the client's safety when you are working in an indigenous setting? So for the next few minutes, I'm going to be sharing some stories that illustrates this concepts and dilemma and realities. So the first one is the story of a 17-year-old girl, Dami, that came to us by way of, she was on academic probation, and the mom had given her money to go to school. She got to school and discovered that she was pregnant and decided to stay off campus. Now, we did not know until one of the tutors brought it to our attention that Dami was expecting and the baby was soon to arrive. When we went out to see Dami, she pleaded with us and said, my mom is hypertensive. She will go into a shock. She could die if she knows what has happened. Please do not talk to her yet. Do not let her know. And we're like, well, we have the responsibility of notifying your mother because she is your primary person. And she was like, okay, this is what we will do. Yes, we will notify my mother, but this is how we're going to do it. We're going to go through her pastor and prayer warriors that come to her every day to pray. So I'm going to talk to the pastor and the prayer warriors about what has happened. And we as the social work unit had to decide, okay, how much do we want to involve other people in this girl's life? But she made the choice. So we had to respect that. And she did call them. And when she called her pastor said, I already saw it in a dream. I already saw it in a vision about what you are going through. Leave it to us. We know how to talk to your mom. So they talked to the mother about this girl being pregnant. And now, those who operate in the Western world, that is not happening if it was somewhere else, okay? So so it was the prayer warriors and the pastor that broke the news to the mother. And after they had done that, we as a school, as an institution, now connected with the mother to let her know that this is what has happened and this is how the girl is being taken care of. So just to let us know that we had to maneuver that very tricky aspect where, how do we respect the client's right? It has the safety. We didn't want to jeopardize other things in her life. Then there's also the story of Emeka, who was a 16-year-old boy that got involved into substance abuse and had faced a disciplinary panel and was suspended and had to go. But the center had the responsibility of notifying the parents. It's what we do. So we tried to connect with the number that was in the records of the school. The phone number was not going through. So we told okay, Emeka, you need to bring your father or your mother, so that we can let them know what has happened. Not long after that, Emeka arrives with a father, and I called a father and said, yeah, this is my father. And in the process of interacting with the father, we noticed that the last name of this man was different from Emeka's last name. Now, this is not unusual, especially in that context of that tribe, where a father could have a different last name from a biological child. You know, the father could give their own middle name to become the last name of the child. So we just had to clarify, and it was in the process of trying to clarify, you know, this, we noticed that there was a lot of awkwardness between Emeka and this man. So we had to excuse the man and said, could we just talk to Emeka for a little bit? And then when the man was out, we had to do that because for Emeka to start telling us in the presence of this man that we found out was not his biological father, but was a neighbor who has been involved in Emeka's care and, you know, even been responsible for part of his fees, it would have been disrespectful. It was almost going to be like disowning him in our presence by saying that, oh, this is not my dad. So he was excused and he explained and said, yeah, this is not my biological father, but he is like a father to me. However, I'm not sure if I really want him to know the extent of what has happened because I feel ashamed and it's a family dishonor to have to go through this situation. So we had to find a way of handling that case scenario on determining this clan father that cared enough to be there. How much information did we want to let him know about Emeka? That was something that we had to make a decision about. And then finally, there's the story of Mambo, who had attempted suicide and was brought to the attention, you know, of our center. And when we started talking with Mambo, Mambo said, oh, yeah, my mother accused me of doing something. And because my mother accused me of doing this, I just felt so ashamed. I felt so angry and all that. And I just wanted to take my own life. Well, we looked at the mother on record and we called. And the mother said, no, I don't know anything. I didn't accuse her of anything. You know, she has not seen me in a while. And we were confused. And it's like, what is going on? Only to discover that Mambo lives with another woman who is like a surrogate mother to her, who was her primary caregiver, but was not biologically connected to her. And she did not want that mother to know that she had attempted suicide. So we had to make a difference and say, okay, so which mother are we talking to? And which mother is going to be the one, you know, that is going to have to take this case up from here? Because both mothers, you know, were involved and they were connected to Mambo. So these are some things that we found out that in the whole course of indigenization and decolonization, that if we are going to look at the place of confidentiality, we need to come up with more guidelines that are more specific to our situation in Africa, particularly in Nigeria. And that is why I put it as the way forward. That one, we need to utilize indigenous models in the formation of our national social work identity, to take from what is going on in South Africa, what is going on in New Zealand, and not base it primarily on global north. And this is a good time for us in Nigeria to do that because we do not have to put in colonization and individualistic and mentalities as we are forming that. And then to receive, affirm, and embrace the extensiveness of our Nigerian families, to receive them and know that they are viable options, that the village, yes, we celebrate the village and they need to be included. However, we've got to come up with clearer guidelines on inclusiveness, of determining family, of determining who gets what. Because yes, though they care, but there's still the issue of suspicion and fear of being harmed and issues of shame that we have to be sensitive to. So that is the realities that we have had to deal with. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Olaore. I didn't even have to cut you short. So, in fact, that leaves us with only 10 minutes. There've been really interesting questions in the chat box. I'm not too sure how in any way we would be able to sift through those. But can I first ask for sure that panelists are all willing to share their slides and that you have all put your emails into the chat box. Could I ask Prof. Rasool just to come back on and tell us about the team meeting that will continue after here? Shahana, are you around?
Yes, Linda, I am. Thank you so much. Linda, this session ends at 3 o'clock exactly because it's hosted by ARIISSW. But this is also part of my class for social work, master students. So I've just shared the link so that anybody who wants to join into the discussion can join us. I don't think we'll stay very long because I think this has been a very long session, but I do think that there's some interesting questions that have emerged that if people want to engage around that, you're welcome to join. I've sent the link.
Questions have been around Ubuntu, around other examples of practice. There've been lots of affirmations where people have said this was really powerful. I think that the session has been one of great significance. And for me as chairperson, just to see how well they cohered, because each of them formed part of the building blocks of what decoloniality should be all about. And in a way, we went right from the principles through to an historic process and how, from a legal point of view, even in a policy point of view, decoloniality can be achieved through to indigenized approaches and the presentation by Dr. Tilton, and then this last one, questioning some of the ethics and the ethical dilemmas. So I know that it was a really rich presentation. It is going to be available. It has been fully recorded. So I encourage people to go back to it and to share the content of it far and wide after this. Would each of the panelists like to say goodbye as an ending, please? Just to greet everyone. Unfortunately, one of the negative things about these online sessions is that people aren't very visible to one another. So perhaps if each panelist would like to say one last sentence about this issue and greet everybody. Prof. Rasool, would you go first?
Thank you so much, Linda. Shahana is fine. I think that thank you so much to everyone for the presentations. And I think it's been really engaging to have real life examples of how decoloniality can happen and is happening. And I do want to say that, the question that was mostly asked to me was about Ubuntu and whether it really exists. We have to make it exist. I do think it does in communities. I'm always amazed by the people who have the least are always sharing the most. And we go back to poor communities, and if we've seen it even in COVID, the little they have, they share. And there is the spirit of Ubuntu. Yes, it's not in the same way as it used to be. In some cases, it is a slogan, particularly in sort of more middle and upper class communities. But I think we have to think of ways to make these concepts and bring back the things that drive our values and make decoloniality a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Shahana. Dr. Muhingi isn't able to come on at the moment. We are trying to get him back, so could I go to Dr. Tilton? Yasmin, it's your call for the moment. You're on mute. Jessie, you're on mute? Still on mute. Still. There we go.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you all very much. It was really a pleasure talking to you. I always have a question and a critique around, does body, mind, spirit practices actually make you turn into a navel-gazing individual? And my answer is always, actually, the intention is to empower people and to make them understand their own wisdom and strength to be able to tackle issues of poverty, unemployment, oppression, etc., etc. And so for me, that's my closing point. That is where the link comes between doing work that's decolonized, indigenized, but also empowering. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much. We'll move on to Augusta, to Dr. Olaore, if you'd like to make your last contribution.
Absolutely. I just go back to us taking a closer look each time we hear that statement that it takes a village to raise a child. For us to look at it critically, how do you affirm the realities of the village? What does that actually mean when it comes to privacy and confidentiality? And to come up with guiding principles so that the village, because we really do need each other. That is what Ubuntu is about. We really do need each other. But how do we have guidelines to protect confidentiality and privacy in the midst of this, so that we have enough information to provide the care and support, and at the same time, we are able to protect the privacy and the issues that are very important to our clients. So when we say it takes a village, what should the village know? Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so very much. One last point I'd like to make is that in the ARIISW conference happening over a period of a month or two, there will be more on decoloniality. So look out for those sessions that might be of interest to people. But I think we should draw this to a close. We are 5 minutes early. Thank you so much to everyone for your active engagement in the chat box. It's been really good, and I know that we'll be able to save that too. And we really do appreciate your comments. Thanks so much. And
Wilkins is there.
And thanks so much
if you want to give him a chance.
Hannah for managing the technology behind the scenes. We really appreciate your platform and your help to all of us. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Linda and Augusta and Yasmin and Shahana and Wilkins. I can't see him yet, but thank you so much. I noticed that all audience has very impressed your presentation, and your this session will be a big impact for the social work discussion. So thank you very much, and we are looking forward to your comments, further comments, and additional sessions. And we will have a roundup session tomorrow afternoon. So please share the comments with us tomorrow morning in your place. Thank you.
Could we just also check where people will be able to access this recording? Where would we find that?
Yes, we will provide the URL or access way immediately after we record it to the cloud, and will be available.
Would that be on your website or on a Facebook page, or where would we find that?
Yes, we have a Facebook, and we have a ARIISW's homepage, and you can access in English too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So, thank you very much. Then this is the information from the office, and another session will start from 2 hours later from now. So I'll see you then. See you later. Next session will be delivered from North America. Thank you very much. Thank you again. Thank you, and bye. Bye.
Thank you, Kana and Linda.
Thank you very much so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Wonderful.